Hello wonderful person, this is Anton, and today we're going to be talking about a relatively unusual discovery, I guess a somewhat surprising discovery, in regards to bacteria. A discovery that seems to suggest that bacteria is able to use chemical signals for communication in a very similar manner to how we use radio signals for communication across the planet. A discovery from the paper that, as always, you can find in the description below. Although in this case the idea of communication is a little bit more broad than what we usually refer to as communication. As a matter of fact, it only refers to extremely simple activity. The activity that's usually referred to as biofilm production, when a single bacteria combines with other bacteria to create a larger colony. And it's in these biofilms that the bacteria start to actively communicate. And actually, let's start with that. Before we talk about the study and the discoveries, it's important to understand what biofilms are. We're all familiar with them, assuming of course you've been to a dentist at least once. So if you were to look at your own teeth right now, or if you were to feel your teeth with your finger or your tongue, you might feel there's some kind of an unusual slimy substance. There's a lot of it between your teeth, and that's why they tell you to floss your teeth, but it's also formed pretty much everywhere in your mouth. We refer to this substance as dental plaque, and it just so happens that this is a simple biofilm. It's a collection of various bacteria that with time become more complex, grow in size, and develop relatively large colonies. And given enough time, they then turn into something a little bit harder as other bacteria join in and start producing the outer shell. And assuming that you don't brush your teeth enough, or assuming that you basically stop brushing your teeth, eventually it can become a large collection of different bacteria living comfortably in your teeth and basically slowly destroying your teeth as well. But all of this unusual film in your mouth and the dental plaque itself basically is an example of a simple biofilm, which represents one of many examples of microbial communities, which already might come as a surprise to you. It definitely came as a surprise to me when I originally learned about it a few years ago. Bacteria are not just these simple single-cellular organisms. They do prefer and actually have a tendency to form very large communities, with some of the most successful bacteria living in these large communities often referred to as a biofilm, which generally follows 5 stages. The first is the initial attachment of bacteria, in this case for example to your tooth, followed by a formation of what's known as the irreversible attachment, which is when individual bacteria start to attach to a certain location and are unable to move from it anymore. And once that happens, the bacteria start to mature, with a lot of other bacteria joining in that new formation. And it then grows into a relatively large colony, often consisting of different bacteria performing different function, kind of similar to, I guess, what we find inside our own bodies, different cells performing different functions. But interestingly, in this case, an individual bacterium starts to act a little bit differently. Usually because of the chemical communication, they do undergo an internal change and start to produce very specific substances and very specific things. In many cases, it's done to actually help the colony as a whole, with the final stage in this case being the stage known as dispersion, which is basically more individual bacteria produced from the colony itself. Here's, for example, an actual image taken by a microscope, an electron microscope, showing a 3-dimensional arrangement of different types of bacteria forming a typical biofilm, which is one of the reasons why sometimes the scientists refer to these as bacterial city. And because overall this increases the success of individual bacteria, different types of biofilm are generally found in a lot of different conditions in a lot of different environments. You'll find them in your kitchen, so for example the stuff you see in your sink, that's a type of a biofilm. You'll also find them in different hospital settings, in various industrial settings. It's also in your pipes and in your drain, and even often causes the clogging of the drain. And they're also of a particular interest to a lot of biomedical scientists, simply because biofilms are also sort of correlated with a lot of different diseases and a lot of problems in our bodies. In other words, a typical biofilm can usually be found in certain medical conditions as well. And so understanding how they form, how they propagate, and how they grow and become more mature is of course extremely important for a lot of different reasons, from industrial reasons to medical reasons. And just to give you that first example I used in the video, the tooth problems, if we were to find a way to regulate the growth of biofilm in your teeth and in your mouth, we would essentially find a permanent solution to the idea of dentistry. We might never need to go to a dentist ever again. And I guess if you're a dentist, I'm kind of sorry about that, you might lose your job. Nevertheless, that would be quite an incredible discovery. On top of this, understanding more about biofilms, how they grow, how they develop, and how they might have actually led to the evolution of the rest of life is also another important reason to study them. Just to give you an example, this right here is a relatively large biofilm formed on top of a hot spring in Yellowstone National Park. It's an extreme type of an environment, but the bacteria found a way to successfully collaborate, cooperate, and survive in these conditions. And it's very important to understand how they do so in order for us to maybe one day find out how life could be doing this elsewhere. Also, quick clarification. Just to help you understand, biofilm is not just some sort of a slime, but in reality represent a very complex biological system with roles, with functional communities, and a lot of coordination on the inside. Coordination that's done through communication with chemical signals. Maybe not as complex as the chemical signals inside our brains, but pretty complex nevertheless. And a lot of these signals will usually guide certain bacteria to perform certain roles. For example, some bacteria might be only responsible for creating the outer shell. Some bacteria might be responsible for some kind of a mobility and for distributing various resources to other bacteria. Moreover, a lot of the bacteria would then also start sharing DNA and teach each other how to basically protect themselves from various antibiotics. So a typical biofilm becomes sort of immune to antibiotics. And the biofilms present inside the human body become somewhat dangerous, mostly because the immune system is unable to fight them. Moreover, this particular strategy is ancient. Some of the oldest samples are approximately 3.2 billion years old. And that of course means that this particular strategy evolved not so long after the first bacteria appeared on the planet. And it eventually led to a tremendous success of bacteria on the planet. But a lot of this success comes from the ability of the bacteria to communicate with each other and to assign roles to each other. But how they do so has not really been well understood until relatively recently. For example, not so long ago, back in 2009, the scientists have discovered that there is one molecule that seems to be responsible for a lot of this communication. It looks like this, and it's known as cyclic diguanylate, or c-di-gmp for short. And this particular molecule seems to be connected to most complex colonial behavior in the vast majority of bacteria out there. Interestingly enough, mostly bacteria seems to be producing this particular molecule, suggesting that this could be basically the communication source for all of the bacteria on the planet. There are obviously some other ones, but this one seems to be the main. And further studies established that this particular molecule is responsible for a tremendous amount of complexity in a lot of different biofilms. In other words, it seems to regulate a lot of complexity, assigning different roles to different types of bacteria in the process. For example, one of the more fundamental rules of this molecule is to signal various individual bacteria to attach themselves to a certain location. At least that's what was discovered a few years ago. But this new paper discovered something completely new and totally groundbreaking. It discovered that the concentration of this particular molecule, as well as the timing of when it's released, in other words, the amplitude and the frequency, kind of similar to the amplitude and the frequency in a typical radio wave, seems to affect the complexity of the behavior in a typical biofilm. The scientists in this case compared this to AM/FM, or amplitude modulation and frequency modulation, suggesting that the bacteria is using these chemical signals very similar to how we use radio transmission. And so by changing the total concentration, which represents the amplitude, and by also changing when this happens, or basically changing the frequency of the release of the molecule, this ended up dramatically changing how the colony progressed, how it formed, and what shape it took afterwards. And what's really interesting is that this particular behavior and this communication would then persist across several generations of bacteria, meaning that the first message would actually be, heard by the bacteria that would exist way afterwards. Specifically, the patterns formed over time in the concentration levels of this molecule would actually define the generations afterwards that would then follow the original message, forming the biofilm in a very specific way. And in some cases, by presenting a certain message, the biofilm would then sort of separate and would detach itself, turning the bacteria back into individual cells and removing the biofilm completely. And so in a nutshell, this particular study might have actually discovered a way to control the communication in the bacterial biofilm, which seems to communicate with all of the bacteria in the biofilm itself. And although obviously it's still too early to tell exactly how to use this to, for example, control a biofilm growth, This right now is an amazing first step. For example, the applications of this in medical industry are absolutely enormous. Being able to stop biofilm from forming would save a lot of lives. At the same time, forming certain helpful biofilms inside, for example, someone's gut could actually help with various digestive problems. There have even been discussions of using biofilm for example, plastic degradation, eating up industrial waste, or potentially generating electrical energy. Although because of the complexity of the communication involved here, as discovered in this paper, it's still obviously a little bit too early to do any of this. As a matter of fact, one of the more unusual discoveries in the paper is in regards to how complex this communication seems to be. The actual signals persist for many generations and at the same time result in these long-lasting messages that a lot of the offspring of initial bacteria use afterwards to create more biofilm or to progress in a certain direction or possibly do something entirely different. So basically a pretty important discovery, but something that we need to learn more about in order to understand it better. And once the scientists do understand this a little bit better, I'll make sure to follow this up with another video. Until then, thank you for watching, subscribe if you still haven't, share this with someone who loves learning about space and sciences, and maybe come back tomorrow to learn something else. Maybe support this channel on Patreon by joining a channel membership or by buying the Wonderful Person t-shirt you can find in the description. Stay wonderful, I'll see you tomorrow, and as always, bye bye.